Okay, so Tall, another poem in Caroline Duffy's collection, Feminine Gospels. It comes after Work and before Loud. And I would say has links to both those poems, but especially to Loud. And Tall is quite an ambiguous poem, not in that it is difficult to find meaning from it, but that there is so much meaning that you can interpret, it's hard to know which one to interpret, as it were. So when I first read this, very first time, I automatically thought this is a poem about the treatment of the marginalised. So I saw the height of the woman as representing the marginalised in society, the fears we have on the unknown, and also looking at how problems get worse if they are ignored, potentially. There's also quite a strong argument that her tallness is a reflection of social mobility, but those are really just two of quite a few different interpretations which can be taken of the poem as a whole, whereas what I'm going to do today is just go through the poem line, stanza at a time and look at the language. I'm going to try and look at it in a lot of detail, but hopefully this video won't be too long. Now, one thing that I noticed when I first read this is what I like to call one of Duffy's exponential poems. And what I mean by that is that the things in it keep getting bigger and bigger. So another exponential poem I would suggest is Work, and another one of her exponential poems is The Woman Who Shot. So these three poems follow each other, and what I see in each of them is, like in maths, where exponential growth sees numbers rise dramatically, so simple sequence 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, each doubling each time. And what you have in The Woman Who Shopped and Work and Tall is there's something that keeps growing. And clearly in Tall, that thing which keeps growing is her height. And we also get to see this in relation to the days as they pass. Perhaps this is a symbol from Duffy, looking at how things can spiral out of control, how things can start off very small, don't think they're a problem, and actually soon they are a massive issue. Now, first line in the poem, and it begins on medio res. I apologise, that accent was awful, I'm not entirely sure what it was. But by starting in medio res, it feels like we're starting perhaps halfway through life, halfway through a line. Perhaps this growth is a sudden onset, and you've got this contrast with if it's a christening gift or a wish arriving later in life, because a christening gift would suggest youth, although not always. Most people who are christened as a baby, whereas a wish arriving later in life seems to allude to an unexpected pregnancy later in life. And you've got these two contrasting ideas, whether it's at the beginning of life, whether it's later in life. Perhaps what Caroline Duffy is saying actually is that whatever the extended metaphor is, whatever the height symbolises, be it marginalisation, be it social mobility, be it something else, as I say, they're the two that I've looked at most. They can start from birth, or they can start later in life. And I think recognising that flexibility and how these things affect people differently is really important. So it's a sudden thing that the woman had height. It's quite an unusual construction, had height. It sounds more like a grammatical construction in a Romance language, and it really brings attention to that part of the poem, and you know that this is important. So grew tall, was taller daily. This is automatic accumulation through emphasis, and you've got a form of tricolon, really, had height, grew tall, taller daily. In some ways that is tricolon, and it serves to do what tricolon normally does, which is emphasise how very important it is, really. And how these things can become the centre of our lives, but also how it's important to the poet. Now, day one is really quite long. So all of that is day one, which brings the focus upon day one, and we're setting the time. And what Duffy uses in this poem, which she's also used in work just before, is where the lines follow on from each other directly. And even this first one, where the first stanza ends in a full stop, is actually continued by a line which starts as far into the line as this one stops. And that's more of a visual thing. You wouldn't notice it if you were having the poem read to you. But it's worth considering why she does put in this as a visual aid. And certainly when you look at the poem, the stanzas are relatively routinely uneven. They're 3 or 4 lines mainly. Some of them are 5 lines. Some of them are really 2 lines, although they are split over 3 lines. And it's quite typical of Duffy. But actually, in the poems on either side of tall, so looking, for example, The Woman Who's Shocked, looking at Work, looking at Loud, looking at History, they all do have a regular stanza length. So it's interesting that Tall doesn't. So day one, she was rising at 8 foot, bigger than any man. And since the tallest man in the world currently measures just under 8 foot 3 inches, and as far as we know, the tallest man who has ever lived was just over 8 foot 11 inches, it is quite true that if you are 8 foot tall, you are likely to be taller than almost any man. But it is interesting that Duffy highlights the fact that this is a man, because throughout her poems in Feminine Gospels, women are the prominent feature. So here she's comparing a woman to a man, and actually the woman is winning, assuming that this height is a good idea. She knelt in the shower as if she were praying for rain is a suggestion of religion, and it links back in with the christening gift. And it gives the impression that she's submitting to whatever it is that's making her grow, but also that she's asking it not to continue. And this, her clothes would be curtains and eider down thousand rug. That links to the map woman. Which also features lists of clothing. And you've got this idea that she is not. And there's also the potential to think that if she's wearing curtains, eider down, thousand rugs, that would suggest potentially that she's falling in society rather than rising in society, which is then again insinuated by the idea that she's going downtown rather than uptown. By now she's eye height with street lamps, which are of various heights, but generally start around 13 to 15 feet, going up potentially to 25 to 27 feet. So quite tall. Clearly by now taller than any person. So you've got this idea that we're entering the realm of alienation. Which is effectively the impossible imagery. You've got somebody whooped. Now I've picked up on this before, that Duffy uses the verb whooped, even though it's not a particularly common verb, and she also uses it in beautiful. And you've got the idea that she stooped hands on both knees, which could be suggested to be condescending, but could equally be her trying to equalise herself with those below, a sign of her embarrassment, a sign of her confusion. And I'd say if you look at this poem as social mobility, it's more from a condescending point of view, whereas if you look at this poem as treatment of the marginalised, it's more trying to fit in. So I think you've got those two sides to it. No. Staring at his scared face. So it's just that she's a subversion of the norm. She is not someone he would normally encounter. So if looking at the marginalised, again, could say people being scared of the other, looking at rise in society, then it's the idea of people moving through classes, but also if she's of a higher class, then it could be quite intimidating potentially for him if he's of a lower class. Red heart tattooed on his small chest is quite interesting. So the colour red has a lot of symbolism around it. Okay, so this is a list of many connotations which could go with red. You might have more you could add, but these are the main ones that I've come up with. If you're looking at a few of these at the end, especially purity and questioning those, then that's actually what the colour red means in some African cultures. So it's always worth being aware of how these can be interpreted in different cultures, especially in this postmodern period when things are going to be potentially translated into many languages and become international. So clearly the implications or connotations of the word red are universal to literature. So I, for example, came up with that list while I was studying The Handmaid's Tale. So heart, we've got the suggestion of love. Tattooed suggests that it's permanent. The small chest, perhaps insignificant, perhaps simply contrasting with her tallness, and you've got the contrast of male and female. So he turned and fled like a boy. In some ways that's an inversion of gender roles. So typically in history you would think of the woman as being the one fleeing from the man. So we've got an inversion suggesting that he's afraid of her. And there's sort of a realisation that her gift of height, is actually quite grotesque. Is not a gift, but potentially a curse. Okay, so then in the next entry you've got this interesting use of a preposition, similarly to out, as a minor sentence, which just brings the focus onto that point. Then the tree dangling an apple, the suggestion of Adam and Eve, the idea of temptation, and again relating back to the religious imagery. Interesting that she's at bite height to an apple tree, because it's worth noting that most apple trees aren't as tall as street lamps. So that could suggest that Duffy is referring, instead of to modern lampposts, a more traditional style of street lamp, or it might just be an interesting, possibly something that's been overlooked. Interesting. But she bit it, she lit it. You've got that parallelism, internal mind. It's giving her the power, which I think is quite interesting. And also really quite mundane things, lighting, biting. And the traffic light stuttered on red, so you've again got this emphasis on the colour red, that it's stuttering, is sort of telling her to stop, potentially. And the personal birds which sang on her ears, well, that reminds me of Snow White. She whistled. It's as though she's trying to fit in with those birds on her ears. Again, next stanza, and starting by mirroring. First it was out, on, further. Reference back to the earlier stanzas, that she is still growing taller. She hasn't stopped growing. And you've got this idea that she's starting to feel isolated. So when she's glancing into upper windows, in some ways she is invading privacy, but at the same time it suggests that she's outside looking in, that she is separate, that she is isolated. So she saw lovers in the rented rooms. Having lovers is often explored in texts, especially illicit sexual relations. There are hints of it in other poems in the collection, such as Beautiful and The Laughter of Stafford Girls High. There's also something which is generally explored quite widely in texts, Handmaid's Tale, for example, The Scrutiny is another one. There are, many, Jane Eyre again. Then you've got this contrast between the lovers in the rented rooms to the old man long dead in a chair. And it's quite powerful that you've got this man who's dead, because he has been forgotten, or it's suggested that he's been forgotten. Similarly, potentially to her, he's been isolated. And although she breathes on the glass, clouding, she's still not able to go into the room. She's still separate. So I think there's a real feeling of isolation apparent here. She bowed herself into a bar, so you've got a couple of different potential meanings of bowed. Potentially she's bowing as a servant, or she could be bending like a bow. So there's an ambiguity there. And ordered a stiff drink. It came on the rocks on the house, and that's quite interesting because those terms, well, on the rocks is associated with drinking, and then you've got this on the house, and there's a double meaning in it. You've got that, is it literally on the house because she's so tall, or is it free, or is it both? The fact that she's ordered a stiff drink at all suggests that she's struggling. It links to Beautiful, but it suggests that there's a need for relief, and possibly Duffy is noting it as a coping mechanism in society. So the drunk par sour faint, and she's sitting at the bar with her knees, and then it's quite different to the previous stanzas where, although they are set up as run-on, for the most part their end stopped and began again. So here it runs on completely. The image of someone pulling up their knees is a sign of anxiety. We've got rhyme again between chin and gin. And gin is a very highly alcoholic drink. It's defined actually by the fact that it must have in Europe at least 37.5% alcohol by volume, 40% in the USA. So it's very strong alcoholic. Usually hear of people having a gin and tonic. So it's interesting that here she's ordering a large gin, and it seems that she's not ordering it to be diluted as a gin and tonic. And then while she's having, you've got quite a powerful, line and a half. She saw a face high in the mirror behind the top shelf, herself. And the top shelf is where you think of people who, top shelf is where you put the things that you don't use very often. It's quite a marginalised place. In our house, the top shelf of our food cupboard is where we put all the bakery stuff, because we don't bake very often and we don't really use that shelf much. But she's not just on the top shelf, she's behind the top shelf, but she's even further back. It's putting her again in this really alienated position. And it's heightened again by the rhyme of shelf with self, highlighting that she is on the shelf, she is not onto. And then we're moving on to day 2. And day 2 is quite a lot shorter than day 1. So day 2 only really takes up 3 paragraphs. Sorry, I keep saying paragraphs, I mean stanzas. So day 2, she was hungover all over, so again, internal rhyme. Perhaps suggesting that she's not used to the drink, that she was using the drink as a coping strategy. And it's worth remembering that all of this is in one day. That's a lot of stuff to happen in one day. And when we were in class discussing this, we were looking into textual links, and what we found interesting is how these lines suggested to us Alice in Wonderland. Her head in her hands in the hall, her feet at the top of the stairs. That picture of Alice when she's in the White Rabbit's house. And again, the emphasis that she's still growing, mortal, and that quite ungrammatical idea doesn't sound very flowing. Mortal, you wouldn't say that in everyday language. And then you've got she needed a turret. It's not that she wanted a turret, it's that she felt she needed a turret. And turret, oh sorry, I've just realised I highlighted that all. So she needed a turret, suggesting that she's excluded. Turret is quite an archaic word. You might normally expect that to be tower. And it reminds me of medieval fairy tales, something like Sleeping Beauty and her isolation. And then just as we've heard, you've got this here, tree dangled at apple, she bit it, traffic light, she lit it. Here, she needed a turret, found one. It's very straightforward. There's no floweriness, as it were. And we've actually got day 3, as I've just said, starting in the middle of a stanza. So day 3, she moved from the edge of town. So again, we're linking to the marginalisation, her exclusion. She moved in, her head in the clouds, and that's another interesting one, because it's quite an idiom. We've got this ambiguity, is her head in the clouds, as though she's not thinking clearly, or is it that her head is literally in the clouds? And what we've got here is showering in rain, which links right back to stanza 2, when she knelt in the shower as if she was praying for rain. And then you've got this idea, but there's a big but. So it's like it's just that actually maybe she's been trying to isolate herself, and what she's doing here is being interrupted. But pilgrims came, that unwanted. She's not really alone. Pilgrims suggests that she's special. You think of pilgrimage, it's very often again religious, but people making a long journey to come and see her. And a small woman with questions and worries, men on stilts. So question, are the women physically small compared to her, or are they small because their worries and ideas are small? Got to hear everyone's coming to ask her what is happening. She was 30 foot, so she's grown a lot in 2 days, from 8 foot to 30 feet, growing. Could see for miles, so she's got a privilege, she's gaining insight. Then, day 6, she up sticks. It's the last day of her tea, day 6. Up 6, very colloquial, suggesting she doesn't fit in, or suggesting that she doesn't want to fit in because she's moving away. Internal power rhyme, 6 sticks. Horizon bound in 7 league routes. Mine is potentially of Gulliver's Travels. Local crowds swarmed. She's become almost a freak show, an object of interest. Swarm is quite an unpleasant verb, and it reminds me of wasps and bees around her feet chanting. Possibly supernatural ideas of chanting around her feet, that they're crowding her. Not particularly. She cured no one. It's just that she has no power. The people think she has power, but she doesn't. And that could be potentially quite painful. Grew, we've got the parallelism again, where we've got several minor sentences out on further. And it's reminders from Duffy are coming more frequently that she is still growing. So, grew, and the moon is coming. I don't know. And the moon, is traditionally feminine image, and it's got a scarred face. Just interesting to compare that to the scared face of the boy, linking them, and how even the moon potentially is somewhat squared of her. In fact, the moon is almost delineated in a negative light. It's scarred face, an old mirror. It's reminding her of herself, reflecting, and she's now become even more marginalised because she's sleeping outdoors. She can't even fit in her tower, her isolated tower. She's sleeping outdoors, stretched across empty fields or sand. She's alone, isolated, she's alienated. And then the pace picks up quite a bit. They've got the stars trembling. Even nature is afraid of her. She's taller, but it's colder, aloner, and no wiser. It's really telling us what we've been inferring. The fact that she has been alienated. And alona is interesting because, as you can see, it's not a verb construction or an adjective construction that we use. Got the tricolon, it's a semantic triplet. Again, she's talking about potentially the isolation of the marginalised or the isolation of the upper classes. So what could you see up there? You've got hyperphora, which is a rhetorical question, which is immediately answered. And now she's been reduced to telling them whether that was heading their way. No, not that telling people whether it isn't useful, it's very helpful. Potentially just being taken for granted though. You've got this hyphen, which suggests a possible connection or a possible separation. Really, it can mean both. And she's telling people about dust storms over pyramids, hurricanes, floods, natural disasters, suggesting that actually she's the bringer of bad news. And again, you've got this idea that she's cut off. She's nothing more. And by now, the people were tiny. And by saying the people, that kind of suggests that she doesn't count herself as a person. She almost feels like she's lost her humanity. And far away. Isolation. She was taller than Jupiter, Saturn, the Milky Way. It just keeps going, linking back to this is an exponential poem. There's nothing to see, so she looked back and howled. Got this reflection, fear, misery. And then you've got this final stanza. She stooped low and caught their souls in her hands as they fell in the burning towers. And what that suggests immediately is 9/11. Especially for someone reading this in 2002 when it was published, literally a few months after that horrific terror attack. So, brief overview of Tool. I hope it's been helpful. If you have any questions, if you've got anything to add, please put it in the comments. And yeah, I hope it's helped you to understand the poem in some way.